Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Hey, buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can snag the tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app now, create an account, and use code GOODSEATS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code GOODSEATS for $20 off. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Download Game Time today. And now, here's our show.
The white flag is out. 1 lap to go. This is it. Last lap.
Stand by for a finish. Two of the greatest fiddling here, fidgeting with first place. Passing some of the stragglers in the last lap. Trying to take it home. It's all come down to this. Out of turn 2, Donnie Allison in first. Where will Cale make his move? He comes to the inside. Donnie Allison throws the block. Cale hits him. He slides. Donnie Allison slides. They hit again. They drive into the turn. They're hitting the wall. They're head on the wall. They slide down to the inside. Let's watch those third place cars. They're out of it. Who is going to win it? 2 cars are out. In the backstretch are the leaders. Watching for the leaders to they're still up in turns 3 and 4. The leaders are up in turns 3 and 4. Coming down, Richard Petty is now pulling out in front. Darrell Waltrip is in second. A.J. Foyt is in third. Here they come. Waltrip trying to slingshot. Petty is out in front at the line. Waltrip to the inside. Petty wins it. Let's look again at that crash. Here it is. They're into the turn already. Spinning, sliding. The hopes for Donnie Allison vanish. Cale Yarborough trying to win his third. He's out of it. A sad moment for these people, but for Richard Petty, hurt all of last year, driving most of the year with a broken and battered body, he comes home a winner today after 45 straight losses. And here comes a $60,000 car becoming a 22-passenger school bus to bring his crew to victory lane. And there's a fight between Cale Yarborough and Donnie Allison. The tempers overflowing. They're angry. They know they have lost. And what a bitter defeat.
A couple of very hard men, very hardly upset. And Bobby Allison is stopped by his brother to help.
Richard Petty in car number 43 battling Darrell Waltrip. Here they come to the line. The photo finish camera was on the checkered flag, and for Waltrip going right down on the apron as he grappled with Richard Petty for first place. But there was no stopping Petty for his 6th win. A man who has lost 40% of his stomach in the past 2 or 3 months, who drove hurt all last year, who hasn't had a win in a long time, comes home the winner of the 21st Annual Daytona 500. Coming up next on CBS Today, the NBA. For David Hobbs, Brock Yates, Ned Jarrett, Marianne Bunch, I'm Ken Squire. We've been delighted to bring you flag-to-flag coverage of perhaps the most amazing, astonishing Daytona 500 in history.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Oh my goodness. How are you, everybody? It's your pal, Tim Hanlon, and it's Good Seats Still Available. Welcome, welcome, and welcome. Welcome back to the proceedings. We are ecstatic to have finally made it to episode number 300, and we're going to kind of dub this one the Good Seats 300, shall we? Why not? Because it's NASCAR time. We're going to be dialing it up and talking about the 75th anniversary of NASCAR, which is this season, if you've been paying attention. Some interesting racing going on, and this is a circuit that is just chock full of amazing stories and tremendous history, ups and downs and all arounds. And we are delighted to have a nice little roundtable this week with our guests from the book. It's now out, just came out last week. It is called NASCAR 75 Years. And it is it's a gorgeous coffee table book, chock full of amazing photography and great decade by decade stories and reminiscences and highlights. And the 4 authors of this tremendous book are here with us this week to roundtable it up, shall we say. as we kind of reminisce about some of the best, most memorable moments of NASCAR's 75 years to date. And of course, we'll get into the current state and perhaps a little bit of future prognostication as well. Al Pearce, Mike Hembree, Kelly Crandall, and Jimmy Creed, all of them extremely knowledgeable about the sport, well decorated in their coverage over the years of this sport, and all of them to a person with their own particular style and take on how to cover the sport, how they have done it, and their own specific points of view on where this, don't call it a league, I guess, call it a circuit, is headed in the future. And it's exciting for yours truly because this summer in Chicago in July, somewhat controversially still in the city in terms of how they're going to handle all the traffic and closure of roads and all that kind of stuff for the big road race here in Chicago. I think it's going to be pretty darn exciting. And it's certainly a breakthrough in how NASCAR presents itself, embedding itself in the middle of a city, taking over literally and figuratively the city for an entire weekend, and frankly, actually a whole month as it gets going. But we're excited to see that here. And it's, I think, emblematic of where NASCAR is headed. It is, I would argue, the last 10, 15 years, it's been kind of wobbly in terms of its fan support. It was just going off our breakneck level of excitement in the early aughts and certainly in the 1990s. But as you heard in that clip, perhaps one of the most breakthrough and maybe even most memorable moments was in February of 1979. Where were you during the middle of February for the Daytona 500 in 1979? In many respects, one of the most exciting, if not the most exciting finishes in the sport's 75-year history. That's Ken Squire and David Hobbs calling the action. In 1979, that was the first time that television actually broadcast the race live and flag to flag. It was on CBS, and it was bolstered in terms of its viewership by the fact that much of the East Coast and the Midwestern part of the United States were suffering through a blizzard. And that weekend, it was challenging for people to get around. And it was no surprise that a lot of people, just curiosity and the like, were home, and they tuned into what was a much more limited buffet of television viewing at that time. And the Daytona 500 more than filled the bill. And it was the buzz. I mean, we're talking about, I think there were a lot of conversions to stock car racing at that time. I think it would be fair to say that even during the 1970s, a regional sport is really what NASCAR was. And that region, of course, was largely the Deep South. Clearly, the roots of that sport emanate from there, and still very much so. But I think 1979 was a seminal moment that introduced to a lot of people who never really gave stock car racing much of a look, that this thing was exciting, built for television in many respects. And not only in terms of racing, but even some fisticuffs and heated arguments, if you will, for these racers who donned their helmets and not quite as safe as today, for sure, automobiles to do battle around these racetracks at ridiculously high speeds. We'll get into a whole bunch of other memories, but that's one we certainly remember, and arguably will set the table for our conversation, our little round table with the four authors of NASCAR 75 years, our new pals, Jimmy Creed, Kelly Crandall, Mike Hembree, and Al Pearce, all joining us now in just a few moments' time for our conversation. The Good Seats 300, if you will, coming right up. Let us point you to that book. Again, it's called NASCAR 75 Years. It literally just came out, and it has got nothing but 5-star reviews. And if you are a huge fan of NASCAR racing, if you are generally interested in racing overall, not just the NASCAR stock car variety, but racing generally, or just a sports fan and could use or benefit from a beautifully photographed and well-written, I guess, introduction to what the first 75 years of the sport has been. Run, don't walk to get this anniversary copy of the book. It is available wherever fine books are found. It is published by Motor Books, an imprint of Quarto. But of course, you can find it conveniently on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 300. My goodness, ring the bell for that. And by buying through that link conveniently there, you will be whisked away to Amazon, and you will give us a few bucks, not bucks, frankly, pennies and nickels, a couple of dimes maybe, let's be really honest, of referral love when you purchase that book and all the other great stuff from all of our other great artists, interviewees, yeah, whatever. They're all artists in their own way. Interviewees from this show, and we appreciate you buying that way for sure. It helps keep our light there we go. It helps keep our lights on more than you know. We appreciate it very much. All right, so enough shilling and boogity, boogity, boogity. Let's go racing, boys and girls. Here's our conversation we had just last week. Please, as always, enjoy. I consider myself, I grew up in the Northeast. I live now in the Midwest. I'm probably the least confused with a NASCAR fan, but I surprise and shock and occasionally delight a lot of people when I tell them that I follow it every week. I even follow trying to do what Haley Deegan's doing in the truck series. And I'm, it's 75 years this year. It's a tall task. And I guess I'd love to maybe just hear from all four of you, where your interest in the NASCAR story comes from, both professionally and personally. And how did this book project come together in the first place? Don't be shy.
I was going to say, who do you want to start with?
Go ahead, Kelly, please.
Oh, geez.
And why don't we identify yourselves too? I think it'll be helpful to the audience. Kelly, since you were first to chime in, why don't you describe yourself, what you do, and your part of it, and then we'll do with the other three.
Sure. So, Kelly Crandall, I am the lead and only NASCAR writer for Racer.com, and I also have a podcast myself, the Racing Writers Podcast. My origin story, I guess, if you want to say, with NASCAR goes back to, an event that many people remember is the death of Dale Earnhardt Sr., the last lap of the 2001 Daytona 500. I was not watching that race, but my father was. My dad at that point was a casual NASCAR fan, but kind of like casual football fans, always tunes in for the big race. And he was watching, and for 6 months after that, all I heard was about that race and Dale Earnhardt's death and how he needed to watch the summer race when the series went back to Daytona. It was going to be special, and he even talked about getting tickets and going to the race with a friend. So anyway, long story short, that's all I heard about. And I sat down and I watched the 2001 Pepsi 400 at Daytona that Dale Earnhardt Jr. won. And that's what hooked me. It was the stories, it was the personalities, it was the speed, the sound, everything that went into that race. That's what hooked me. And by the time I was in high school, I believe it was, English classes, writing was always my favorite, and realized I could combine the two things that I liked, which is racing and writing. And here we are. As far as how the book project came together, you got to ask Mike Hembree about that. That was his bright idea to bring me on board for this. So I appreciate it. He was the one that roped me in, and I was happy to do it.
All right, Mike Tagg, you're it.
Hi, I'm Mike Hembree. I work for NBCSports.com, covering NASCAR. One of a string of auto racing related jobs I've had over the years. I grew up in NASCAR country in Spartanburg, South Carolina, but really wasn't a fan growing up. I would read about it occasionally and watch a little on TV here and there, but not really a fan. Started to work in journalism, got a job in the sports department, and the gentleman who was covering NASCAR for us left the paper, and I was called in the next day by the boss and told that I was now an auto racing writer and had never even been to a race. So I had a lot of catching up to do quickly. I wasn't really that impressed with the job when I was told that I had it, but I caught on pretty quick, I guess, and discovered that there were a lot of people to write about, a lot of different personalities. Everywhere you go on the circuit is different as far as the people you meet and the people you interact with. So, and obviously a lot of characters in the sport, particularly in the 70s when I started. If you couldn't find a story to write about in the garage at any particular race, you just weren't trying hard enough. The book itself, it was almost an easy decision by some publisher to do a 75th anniversary book about NASCAR. And I had done a coffee table NASCAR book some years back. So the publisher got in touch with me and asked me about doing 2 or 3 chapters in the book, and I readily agreed. And of course, Jimmy and Al signed on, and the publisher was looking for somebody to do the more modern chapters. And I thought about Kelly. She's been around a few years now, and obviously very smart and knowledgeable about what's going on and what has gone on, and talked with her about getting involved, and she was ready to do that. So here we are.
Al, Jimmy, does that mesh up with your recollections of how this came together?
I lied like a bandit to get my first newspaper job. And the source of the lie was, we need somebody to cover NASCAR. This was in 1969. I had just gotten back from Vietnam as an Army officer. I didn't have a job, didn't have any prospects. There was no market for Vietnam captains, so I decided I'd become a civilian. But the local paper here in Newport News needed a NASCAR guy. And I knew that because when I did my interview for the job, the sports editor said, well, can you cover football? Of course I can. What about basketball? Oh, yeah. Baseball? Sure. Tennis, golf? Yeah, I know all that stuff. What about stock car racing? I knew absolutely nothing. I knew less than nothing. But I knew that if he was going to ask me a question that specific, I better have the right answer. I said, "Oh man, yeah, of course." I said, "I'm from North Carolina." I said, "Richard Petty's from there." I mean, I've been to Daytona for the 500, which I had been as a fan years earlier. I said, "I know all that stuff." And he said, "When can you start work?" And I said, "Well, like right now?" And he said, "Yeah." And that was 55 years ago. The first race I covered was Dover in July of '69. And this most recent Daytona 500 was my 54th in a row. So I kind of, like I say, if I had not told the sports editor that I thought I could do NASCAR or stock car racing in general, because there was a local track I had to work with, I don't know what I would have done. I know I needed a job, and can you cover stock car racing seemed to be the magic question, and I had the right answer. And I've been at it like Mike and Jimmy and Kelly. I've been at it pretty much on a daily basis now forever, and don't really see an end, but obviously it'll happen sooner or later.
Well, Al, that's the quintessential one door closes, one door opens, and you know, you want to make sure that you step through that door properly, and it seems like you have, and that door is firmly closed in your benefit, which I think is great. And Jimmy, you get the final word on the origin story of you and this.
Well, I guess I come by my NASCAR. A love of NASCAR naturally. Born and raised in Talladega, Alabama, about 10 miles from the track, in the house that I still currently live in. In fact, if you, as a kid, it was always cool on Sundays. If you didn't go to the race, you could sit on my front porch, and when they first started the race and they had all the cars cranked up, you could actually hear the cars running at the track from sitting on my front porch. And can't tell you for sure which which was the first race I went to at Talladega, but I can tell you the first vivid memory that's burned into my memory banks from that track was when I was in high school here. It always seemed to work out where the spring break fell during race week, and so that was fortunate for me. I was able to usually able to find someone to take me out to the track, and that was way back when they did qualifying on Thursdays, and way back before the advent of the restrictor plate. And so there was always a chance. Qualifying was a big deal at those times, and Al and Mike can both tell you, because there was always a chance that there was going to be a new speed record. And so my first vivid memory of Talladega is being there on the Thursday that Bill Elliott set a record that'll never be broken now, when he won the pole at 212.809 miles per hour, I think. And so
that's without restrictor, right?
That was without restrictor plate. Yeah, I believe that was. I don't have it right in front of me. I think that was the '85 spring race in Talladega, and at that time they ran the other race in July, if you can believe it. But that was my first vivid memory of that. And then the book itself, I owe a big thank you to another longtime NASCAR beat writer named Larry Woody. I think Larry was approached first about doing this chapter, and Larry was a longtime writer for the Tennessean in Nashville, and a great guy, one of the funniest human beings I know. And he didn't. He wanted to pass on it, but he gave me a recommendation, and so I was very happy to get on board on a project like this.
All right. Well, so let me sort of ask, I guess, the first question I kind of want to get to is sort of process, and then we can get maybe to some of the nuggets of history that you use to shape and go deep in, both from a personal perspective as well as historical perspective. But let's focus first on process, because this is probably one of the, if not the most unique sports histories you're going to find in American sports, right? It's a family-owned, single entity, literally created from scratch, quote unquote, sport that is not. It's part of a bigger sporting realm. This thing called auto racing, but it's its own unique and specific thing that's just grown into something that's just so that it just is available and permutated on so many different levels. How do you structure this 75 years? Like, how do you even create a skeleton, I guess? Maybe, Mike, this is for you, but how do you where do you begin to kind of just put the guardrails on what you're going to do to kind of just guide this story before you all four of you start to, dig in and actually do the story?
Well, the publisher sort of helped us out there by saying, okay, you do the 60s, you do the 70s, you do the 90s. So we were able to sort of bracket the history within those 10-year periods, which made it more manageable. And we had, had different people doing each section or sections. And that was really the only way to handle it. It's such a long period of years, and so many things happen, so much changed, not only across all those years, but even from one year to the next, so much can change in NASCAR that you can hardly keep up with it. So you had to have some kind of, parentheses around a particular section or time so that you could deal with it. And it was kind of convenient in that those decades sort of arranged themselves as far as the way things changed. The 50s were all about, or almost all about, racing on dirt, short tracks. Then the 60s came along, and that was the super speedway era, when people started building big tracks everywhere and the sport sort of got its feet. And then the 70s, Winston came along with the big sponsorship and took things to a whole new level. So there were instances that sort of labeled each decade, and that was at least the way I approached my part of the book was trying to do a theme sort of for each decade, and that seemed to work out the best.
They asked me which decade I wanted, and I said, "Well, I'm actually older than NASCAR itself. I was born a long time before NASCAR was." So I said, "Listen, I started in '69 when Talladega was first created. Let me have the entire decade of the '70s, because that's when I was in my first 10 years of my 54-year reign. So let me have the '70s, which included R.J. Reynolds, like Mike said. It included the appearance of television, the famous '79 Daytona 500, in which Cale Yarborough and Donnie Allison wrecked, and there's some other races in the '70s that became legendary. So it was natural for me to spend my time on the decade of the '70s, since that was the first decade of the sport that I had been through in total. So they asked what I wanted, and I said, I'll take the '70s because I lived it. So I don't know how Jimmy and Kelly got their decades, but I got mine because that was when I was first showed up.
Well, that was pretty much the same for me. They asked me which one that I would like, and I said I would like the '80s because pretty much the same reason as Al there. That was when I first really got into it, and a lot of my earliest recollections, and I don't know about the process for everyone else, but I literally just sat down and started out and made a list of bullet points of everything that I could think of pretty much right off the top of my head that I felt like absolutely positively had to be in my chapter. And then I had the task of whittling it down to something that was realistic. It was a tough task from the standpoint of, what major event or major happening or milestone do you take out? But when I was finished with the chapter, I felt like I had done a pretty good job of hitting on all the major high points from my decade.
Yeah, it sounds like Jimmy and I kind of had the same approach. I did the same thing. I came on probably the last one to come on board, so the 2000s to present, as Mike said, were really kind of in my wheelhouse. That was what I'm most familiar with and comfortable with. So I was lucky in that regard. And they asked me if I wanted to take, just 10 years or a couple years. And I said, I'll take all of it. So I was excited and eager to do it. But as I said, Jimmy and I, we had the same process. I took a legal pad and I started off by just jotting down bullet points or ideas or events or drivers, rule changes, whatever it may be that I thought I would want to include in the chapter or that should be included in the chapter. And then it would go back and refresh my memory, pull up, different web pages, I went through other NASCAR books. I went through the history of NASCAR books, so just refreshing my memory on things, and just kept adding to the pages on the legal pad of things that should be included, should this be included. And just like Jimmy, by the time I sat down to write, it was, okay, what can be included? How important is this to include? And really the way I approach my chapter might be a little bit different from what I've seen from Mike and Jimmy and Al. What I've read so far from theirs is I wanted to focus more and be a little more broad, because I felt like the 2000s to the 2010s to the 2020s, there's so much change in the sport, whether it was from Bill France Jr. to Brian France to TV packages, the schedule, the playoff format coming into play, the technology, whether it was the car of tomorrow or other technological advances. So I took a more broad approach in trying to highlight as much as possible from those decades, instead of being, as I would say, maybe a little fancier on focusing on driver battles or stories in that regard. I took an approach of, there was so much that happened through all those decades that I wanted to highlight again, how much the sport had changed throughout that time. So that was, again, it was what I was comfortable with, thankfully, because I was familiar with it. And then I was just reminding myself of other things. And as Jimmy said, just trying to whittle it down and figure out what makes sense to include and what's going to get left on the legal pad.
You know, it's interesting because it seems like it's an impossible task, especially given the fact that this book it's a coffee table type book, right? So much more heavy on the photographic imagery, and obviously the words that accompany that, the stories and stuff have to be, how can I best put it? Pretty succinct, right? Which is even a harder challenge than writing maybe 100 pages of stuff, right? Where you have plenty of time to let the story, breathe and get the quotes and all the sort of nuances and stuff, right? So the economy of words in a format like this is probably even a bigger challenge for a writer, given those constraints. And I wonder, the question in there is, number one, is there a bigger opportunity to do narratives by these decades beyond just this book? It feels to me like this is almost the tip of the iceberg. And then number two, well, let me ask you that question. Do you think there's more narrative expansion, shall we say, that could be brought to this story someday, perhaps as a series, maybe as a book a decade, that kind of thing? Has there been any discussion about that? Not that this isn't a good format, but to me, this is almost like the sampler platter, if you will.
I can speak to that. The short answer to that is yes. There are many narrative branches you could jump on from this tree trunk, I guess, and some of us have done that in some other books. I've written several about NASCAR, including an overall history some years ago from start to finish. And I think what you have to do is look at the characters. Richard Petty, the most famous of all, several books have been written just about him. Same with Dale Earnhardt, Carl Yarborough, at least a couple about him. So the challenge of this particular book was taking the best stories of those people and kind of meshing them together with the history of NASCAR overall, and seeing how it kind of came out when you put it all together. And those particular names, Petty, David Pearson, Bobby Allison, Dale Earnhardt, Dale Jr., Jimmy Johnson, Jeff Gordon, they keep popping up as this long historical tale is told. But you're right, any number of these characters in this book could be a book of their own, and indeed some have been. But there are a lot more stories to tell, for sure.
Yeah, and let me also then throw that second question there, because one of the names that you didn't mention, and I think for this becomes sort of the interesting sort of side question, is the France family, right? Uniquely entwined and a part of the story, of course, for obvious and maybe even not so obvious reasons. But I guess the challenge of doing this as an officially licensed NASCAR book, right? It's probably pretty straightforward, but clearly there are plenty of twists and turns in the story over the years that, how could I say, journalistically could be more questioned or nuanced, or maybe even more differently approached. So I got to think that there's some level of constraint in your ability to tell the narrative, I guess, up to a point, right? Because there are obviously things that I'm sure NASCAR's not excited about maybe remembering or bringing to the fore or whatever.
Well, oddly enough, I didn't see any real fences put up in what I was asked to write about, which I did find a little bit surprising, frankly. You're talking about auto racing, you're talking about the possibility of somebody dying every week, and a lot of people died over these 75 years, particularly before a lot of the safety advances went into effect. But there's a lot of that in this book, and as far as I can tell, none of it was really whitewashed much, if at all. And I've had experiences in other situations where some things were kind of danced over. But I think this book is pretty open in the situations that we had to deal with about death, about controversies that came up, about problems along the way and things that didn't go the way they should have, etc. I understand what you're saying, and the France family, particularly Big Bill France, the founder, really good grip on things over the years. A benevolent dictatorship, as it was known for some time.
Sure.
But yeah, I think what's in this book is pretty open. I'm not sure what the others' experiences were in that realm, but I really didn't run into any fences.
Well, I can tell you that I had one of those type situations in my chapter for the 1980s that I had to address. We had to address it up front, and that was the life and the career of and the death of Tim Richmond in the 1980s. And we had a discussion, the publisher and I had a discussion about how do we handle that, because it was such a big story at the time that it needed to be included. But what we decided was that was to just handle it pretty much like any of the other information that I was going to put in the chapter. And so there was a whole lot of things in my chapter that I could have expounded on or expanded on at great length. And so I just made mention of the situation with Tim Richmond, mentioned that he was later announced that he had died of AIDS, and then I just moved on. And that, as far as I know, that the exact wording that I used there, manuscript that I turned in my first draft, was the exact wording that's in the book that's published now. So I agree with Mike. I don't feel like that there was anything that had been or was whitewashed here, but we did have to kind of make some conscious decisions about how you handle things and what kind of play you gave it.
Yeah, and that's heartening because, I especially too for fans who are aware of NASCAR, or casual fans, or come in and out of it, say during Daytona, or some of the marquee races, and don't follow it sort of week to week and stuff. I mean, it's unavoidable, right? I mean, and it's not necessarily nefarious or overshadowed per se, but this is, like I said before, this is perhaps one of the most unique stories in all of American sports, in that this is not only single entity, which is now becoming sort of all the rage, I guess. I mean, Major League Soccer and any new sport, it seems, has, single control, and the franchises are not franchises. They're actually parts of a bigger whole, but it's also a family run thing still to this day, or heavily overseen by, right? No influences from outside investors and that kind of stuff. And to me, you look at it from a purely journalistic / cynical perspective, you worry about sort of that maybe potentially compromising the story. Now, look, we're talking about history here, right? This is not sort of an investigatory kind of thing. But I think to casual fans who know that, and even maybe the diehard fans, right, they recognize that it's you said benevolent dictatorship. It's a probably apt description. I think there's obviously, I'm sure there will be some people who will look at this book, want to see as much of the history as they can, and would not be surprised if there was something that was sort of over, maybe sort of skated around or whatever. But it doesn't sound like that's the case. And I think that's heartening because, in many respects, I mean, you even mentioned the Tim Richmond thing. That he's emblematic of what was going on in society around that time, and NASCAR and all of its wisdom was not immune to it. And he was a flashy He was a flashy personality, unavoidable. He was quite the fan sensation. It would be very hard to deny that part of that story during that decade, right?
Right. It would have been impossible. It would have been a huge omission if we had left out Tim Richmond in any form in that chapter, either chronicling his his career and his exploits on the track, or how his life ended.
Well, let's not kid each other. NASCAR only lets us know what they want us to know. There were certainly moments in the Tim Richmond saga that we don't know about. There were certainly moments that Bill France Sr. and Jimmy Hoffa and some of those people that we really don't know about. We know that there was an attempt to unionize the drivers. We know where France stood. We knew where Jimmy Hoffa stood. But there's probably a book's worth of stuff that we don't know, and we will probably never know. We may never know the true story of what Brian France was doing the day he got caught in New York drunk driving. We may never know all the details. They tell us all about what Dale Earnhardt died of, and they parade doctors out and they parade out autopsy reports. How does anybody know that what we were told that night was really what it was? I'm not just a second. I'm not saying it was a massive cover up in any area, but there were things that we probably would like to have known that they don't want you to know that. The night that Lee Petty and Johnny Beauchamp and Joe Weatherly took the checkered flag in the first Daytona 500, 3 wide, within an hour or two, Bill France knew who the race winner was. Had no question about it. He waited until Wednesday to make the announcement. He wanted to milk that as long as he could, which is part of his genius. But we don't know what all exactly went on when T. Taylor Warren went to him and said, Mr. France, here's clear-cut evidence that Lee Petty won. And France told him basically, shut up, I'll tell you when we'll announce it. So, yeah, Mike, you're right. There are things that the book publisher never called us on because maybe we did not know more about what we were writing about than they wanted us to. Kelly?
Well, it's interesting that Al mentioned Brian France and his arrest in 2018, because that was, of course, in my chapters, in my decade that I had to cover. And I remember I initially wrote that the same way that I had covered it at the time, and giving the detail that we had and explaining what had happened, and going into how that eventually led to Jim France becoming the interim president and CEO to just, not president, chairman and CEO to just quietly taking over that role as Brian left the family business. And the publishers were very upfront when they sent back their edits, and they sent back some conversation and communication that, that was something that we weren't erasing, but we were just going to tighten it up. We're not going to gloss over it, but it had to be highlighted that he had left and that Jim France was now the man in charge. But I guess the best way, as Jimmy and everybody else have explained, is you just tighten it up. You don't gloss over it, but maybe you don't go into thousands and thousands of words on it. That could be something, as you said earlier, Tim, that could be a whole nother narrative, a whole nother story, a whole nother book on Brian France's time in NASCAR. So again, I wrote it as honest as I could write it, and I understood why the editors and the publishers were doing what they had to do. But I was just glad that in the end, as I said, it wasn't completely taken out. And or at least as far as I know, from what I remember when I got the book, it was in there. So that was the best that I could hope for, and I understood why they were doing it.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to stir up anything. Don't get me wrong, but I'm glad you're all sort of responding sort of in an honest way, because I mean, regardless, I mean, first of all, I think the fans understand the deal, right? I mean, they know this is that they've grown up with the culture, they understand, and it to any outsider, it's not surprising because it's a closely held private entity that's family owned and controlled and has been since essentially day one or day -1. So I think everybody kind of just generally understands that this is just part of what's what. And I've seen this in other scenarios, and other not only in other sports, but just in other histories, right? And stuff. It's the temptation is there to in some cases sanitize. I'm not saying that's the case here, but to keep things on the relative straight and narrow. And the fact that you are all sort of successful in throwing out the parts of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Maybe it's a little less ugly than maybe NASCAR wants it, but that's what makes the history, right? Is to own it, right? And if it was wrong at the time or something untoward happened or whatever, that's kind of how we all sort of apparently learn and grow and don't make the same mistakes twice and that kind of stuff. And I got to think that's harder in a very closed society, if you will, than, if you were kind of tackling the history of the NBA or some other league that's sort of been around with a little bit more, shall we say, air running through the vents, so to speak.
Yeah, Tim, I think it's good to point out here that the four of us are and have been daily journalists, doing what's been called, I guess, the first draft of history every day. So when we look at big controversial topics like Richmond's death and any number of things that have come up over the years, which made big headlines, we typically have written about those in the moment, with as much information as we could gather about those things. And then a few days later, we move on to something else. There's something else to cover, something else to write about. And then when you look at a book like this, where you're having to get so many happenings, so many races, so much stuff into a relatively compact chapter, about a decade, there's just really not space to get deep into these individual things. And that's part of the handicap, I think, with a book like this. You're trying to do so much that you just can't get expansive looks at everything in.
No, I get that. And, with our remaining time, I think I want to throw it to the four of you to kind of maybe put you on the spot a little bit, to maybe kind of surface perhaps a particular point in NASCAR's history that you were either part of or that you did it and researched and stuff to kind of put sort of these things sort of in perspective. And it's an impossible task to pick just four. But I'll throw one out just to kind of begin, and I don't want to steal anybody's thunder, or if I am, then you can sort of follow on. But I think for a certain generation of fan, that's I don't know. I don't know if it's a pivot or it's an apex, or if it's a bright hot comet in the history. But I think there are a lot of people, especially those in the, shall we say, classic ball and bat sport types, that would probably say, and where the casual NASCAR fan would probably say 1979's Daytona 500, simply because of the literally and figuratively perfect storm that sort of occurred between weather, television, the race and the dramatics of it, that I don't know if it put it on the map on a national level per se, but it certainly feels to me, and again, I'm not as schooled as you are in all the history as you all are, but it feels to me like that feels like a massive change of the chessboard when you look back on the arc of this sports history. Would you agree, disagree?
Yeah, the fact that it was on live national television is what made it what it was. If that had happened 3 years earlier, when there had not been live TV, two guys wreck on the last lap of a big event, it had happened before, and there was not television live at all of those. In my mind, that the 79 Daytona 500 and the inaugural Brickyard 400 are the two on-track events that I think carried the sport forward more than anything. The other thing being off-track, R.J. Reynolds and its money, it really saved it. It gave NASCAR a second, third, and fourth breath at a time when it was struggling a little bit. So those three were all part of, well, not Indy, but Daytona and RJR are part of my decade, or part of my chapter. And yeah, I think those two are big deals. And I think the Brickyard was a huge deal.
Well, Tim, I can speak to this from a fairly unique perspective because I wrote a book with Donnie Allison called As I Recall. And in fact, the book itself starts out with Donnie the night before the 79 Daytona 500. And he talks about how he got up and is looking out the window, and that was such as you said, an incredible, a perfect storm, if you want to call it, because he's looking out the window at a huge rainstorm. There was really a lot of doubt that race would even be run. And he went on. He always says that Big Bill France had a unique relationship with the man upstairs because the whole entire Eastern Seaboard is snowed in with once in I guess they call it 100-year storm. It's raining in Daytona right up almost until the time for the green flag, and then they get the race in, and they get that incredible finish. But I can tell you that those of us that are close to Donnie and a lot of race fans feel like that is the race that put NASCAR on the map. And I can tell you that Donnie says that he wishes that he had $1 for every time that NASCAR has used some of that footage in their marketing and promotional campaigns, and he'd be a very rich man.
Well, look, the only reason I bring that one up is because, and I think this is, I think it's emblematic of a certain form of sports fan, right? Northeast, Midwest, the arrogance and the history of the quote unquote traditional sports and stuff. And that was like the first time it really it was unavoidable. And man, it was something that was so new to people in sort of those staid and traditional kinds of mindsets that it really opened up a lot of people's eyes to that this thing was a sport. I mean, the tape delay on ABC, I mean, certainly that was there for years prior to that, right? But the in-car thing, I mean, it truly was just a confluence that I think really kind of just spun things out to a whole new orbit. And NASCAR just had to be giddy coming into the 80s.
Tim, there's no question in my mind that the 79 500 is the event of the 75 years. There are so many other big races, though, that have come along. In my mind, 3 years before that, the 76 500 had what I still think is the greatest finish of any NASCAR race, when David Pearson and Richard Petty crashed coming out of the fourth turn, racing for the win. That was on live TV too. The last part of the race was picked up live. Different circumstances. There wasn't a fight. There was people weren't snowed in across the Northeast or whatever. But it was a tremendous finish between the two guys who were the titans of the sport during that period. Also, you got to look back at the first Southern 500 in 1950, when 75 cars started a race on a little track, a little over a mile long. The race took like 6 hours to finish, but they did finish it. Somebody won it. And as Al said, the first race at Indy was a really big deal because of the barriers that were crossed after Indy and NASCAR had been had been so far apart for so many years. To see that happen was certainly big.
All right, what's this? Game time? Fantastic. Hey, buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can snag the tickets without the stress with the Game Time app. And I will tell you, the Game Time app has gotten me out of a couple of jams on more than a few occasions. I'll tell you, a couple of weeks back, I travel fairly often for work. I was stuck in New York. I had dinner plans fall through during a business trip. I was leaving the next morning, but had some time on my hands. And what's a sports guy like me to do? Well, scouring around to see if there are any events going on. And sure enough, the Knicks were playing the Nets at home at the world's most famous arena. So about an hour before the game, I fired up the Game Time app and found a decently priced ticket. I won't tell you what the people around me paid for their ticket, but it certainly wasn't nearly as expensive as theirs. And I got to watch the Knicks in a rare moment of amazingness kick the snot out of the Nets. But that's Game Time is the place to get your last-minute tickets. They've got a tremendous set of deals, flash deals they call them, and last-minute tickets. They're easy to find and buy for just about every kind of event you want, sports and entertainment and music, that kind of stuff. The images, the seat views are just perfect. They're great. That's always like the big conundrum when you're looking at a seating chart. You have no idea where you're going to be, what your view is going to be like. And Game Time's got probably the best imagery that I've seen of any of the ticket sites out there. And of course, they've got a lowest price guarantee, including event cancellation protection. So you know you're going to be covered in case. As a matter of fact, that the Game Time guarantee means that you'll always get the best price. And if you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Don't believe me? Try it for yourself. Download the Game Time app now, create an account, and then on us, use the code GOODSEATS for $20 off of your first purchase. Again, that's the Game Time app. And it's also, you can check them also out at gametime.co. But get the app, download the app now, create an account, and use the code GOODSEATS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply for sure. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. It's Game Time. Thank you, Game Time, for your sponsorship of this week's episode. And now, back to our conversation. You guys also spent a bunch of time on the super speedways, that sort of 1960s sort of era. I mean, at Talladega, we sort of hinted at it before, and just the sheer monstrosity and of that and the speeds that were achieved, taking the racing to a whole nother level. But also at the same time, and this obviously sort of appeals to our audience in particular, right? Is the beginning, and I think we saw it certainly more in the 2000s and still even ongoing now. I'm sure Kelly can speak to this. Is the, I don't know, the right word is abandonment of some of the tracks that got NASCAR to where it is, but certainly a moving on, shall we say, perhaps from some of its roots. Interestingly, this year, right, a throwback, at least for one race at the All-Star break in North Wilkesboro, sort of at least as a tip of the cap to that, right? But I think it's undeniable, and it's certainly thematic in what I've read thus far in this book, that it is a bit sort of a double-edged sword-id and wistful, right? In that you've got some great tracks that are part of this sport's history and this entity's history, yet it's also sort of fighting with itself to sort of evolve, right? And go to the newer and to the faster and to the street races in Chicago this summer, which I'm looking forward to. What are your thoughts generally about that, or maybe even some specifics about, say, tracks and races that, you know, have come and gone, and that sort of fitful relationship with the sport itself as it continues to grow and modernize?
Well, I think you hit it right on the head, which is there's the battle of its roots and the sport evolved. You look at the 2000s and even the late 90s of how the sport just boomed in popularity. It got so big. You look at the racetracks and how many grandstands were being built, and you look at the racetracks that NASCAR was going to, but then realizing that they wanted to expand and be a national, they became a national sport. So they wanted to go to different markets. And listen, Jimmy, Mike, and Al can talk more about that than I can of, the races that lost dates on the schedule because NASCAR wanted to take it elsewhere and go to other racetracks. But Tim, you made a good point. It's interesting now to look at the sport and look at the people in charge and look at how the fans are being heard, and even the drivers of all of these racetracks, or you mentioned North Wilkesboro, they don't want them to completely go away. We're bringing some of them back. Wilkesboro coming back is absolutely amazing. I think that's going to be an absolutely unbelievable weekend. I think the atmosphere is going to be incredible. The drivers are really looking forward to being at that racetrack. The fans that I see, whether it's on social media or that talk to me at the racetracks, cannot wait to watch it or attend. But then, you also mentioned Chicago, right? There's still also this constant need to try new things and go to new markets and try to bring racing right to the heart of these cities and where the race fans are. So it's a very interesting balance of the folks who want NASCAR to go back and not forget its roots, but the sport also trying to use the word evolve. That's exactly what it is, and continue to take it to new places. So as I said, I mean, the other three can certainly speak more to those races that fell off the schedule, but it's so interesting to see how the circuit, how the schedule has changed so much throughout the years and the different areas that the sport was going and why they thought that was a good idea.
Well, I think it's very interesting that you do see NASCAR looking at it and kind of going back to the roots, so to speak. If you had told me 5 years ago that there would ever be another event at North Wilkesboro, I would have probably said, no way. There's no way that's ever going to happen. That track is just going to fade into oblivion. And I think it's good that NASCAR is paying attention to the things that a lot of the fans want, and because I think that in a lot of respects, and just speaking my own personal opinion here, but the NASCAR grew too fast. The early part of this decade, I think NASCAR grew way too fast. They tried to expand into a lot of different markets. I know they were looking at New York at one time, at Seattle. They went to Chicago. They went to Los Angeles, and I think that was in some ways that might have been a speed bump for the sport. But I think now that they're looking at it and going back a little bit, I think the North Wilkesboro race is a great idea, and I'm glad to see NASCAR trying things and looking for things that will work.
It's ironic in my mind that fans are so excited about Wilkesboro, and fans generally don't give a hoot about the Coliseum, whatever it's called now, the Busch Clash or the
Clash of the Coliseum
season racing. Fans generally pan that because they don't like the idea of going into a football stadium. They'd much rather have that preseason race at, say, Rockingham than out in the West Coast. California has closed down Ontario, closed down Riverside, closed down Auto Club Speedway. So I don't know that Southern California is the end-all, be-all that NASCAR would like it to be, but they still go out there every year and run on the football track, whereas they could do the same thing at Bowman Gray. So, they've closed a lot more. They've closed a lot of tracks and taken down a lot of seats, but they didn't become billionaires by making bad decisions.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's all. That's very interesting, and it's true. It is like I remember. I think I came into real consciousness of the sport in the '90s. I was actually I'm dating myself now, but I worked at this little credit card company called MBNA America, and you may remember this. Some of you, they were the official credit card issuer of NASCAR, and part of all the employees at MBNA had to do various things. We had to do customer service to, get in touch with the consumer, and they'd send us out on these events to market the credit cards and stuff. And yours truly, his first event was to go to a NASCAR race in Concord, North Carolina for I think it was the fall race at that time in Charlotte.
Bill Davis and Ward Burton.
There you go. That's right. But that the time of the '90s, I mean, it was an explosion, right? And it's kind of hard not to, if you look back, and I'm sure you all sort of see this in your historical look backs, right? It's hard not to be excited at just the sheer explosion of growth and interest at that time, and not think that, hey, the next boundaries that we need to break through are, more of a national footprint, right? Television, media, cable, all that kind of stuff, right? I mean, that's the lifeblood of sports, especially now, or streaming or whatever, right? That national footprint matters to quote unquote national advertisers and sponsors. And yet it seems like NASCAR's now having to kind of rebuild sort of that sort of national footprint approach. And maybe even to your point, Al, rethink it a bit. And maybe some of the markets don't make a lot of sense, or maybe they're more once in a while versus twice a year, like Atlanta. I don't, it never seems like NASCAR is satisfied with the right balance. And maybe that's a good thing, because at least it shows there's there's listening and evolution sort of still afoot. And, plenty of leagues have spent a lot of time fighting off some of those things. It seems like NASCAR's at least needs to be credited for at least trying things.
Well, Tim, part of what's happening too is attendance has gotten quite a bit better since the pandemic and the ramping back up from that. But in some of the previous years, the crowds at some tracks were considerably down. So I give NASCAR credit for looking at situations like that and saying, well, why do we keep going back to these places when the crowds aren't good? Let's try something else. It may not work great, but let's try it. I give them credit for that. The LA Coliseum race had a pretty good crowd year one, down somewhat this year, still decent, I guess. Got a lot of publicity. Doesn't mean you have to do it every year. They're going to try the Chicago street race this year. That may or may not work. But just the fact they're willing to try that has already gotten the attention of some other larger cities who've indicated, hey, this might be something we want to take a look at and at least talk about. So I think for decades, NASCAR was stuck in sort of a rut where they didn't change anything as far as the tracks go. Kept going back everywhere twice a year, and it worked for a long time, but it reached a point where I think in a lot of cases there was oversaturation, and then the product went downhill to a degree. So now they're in a situation where they really need to try different things.
Let me draft off of that, no pun, maybe pun, for all of you to kind of sort of weigh in on, I guess, sort of the last sort of cul-de-sac of question here, which is, where do you think NASCAR stands right now and in the sports landscape, and what do you think of its immediate future? I mean, there's a lot of question marks sort of surrounding all of it, right? So clearly management, well, maybe not management. It clearly seems that the France family is still very much in control, but the television rights are going to be up relatively soon. Streaming is now the way that most people consume stuff versus linear television. Formula One in the United States has come out of literally nowhere versus being a niche prior, and largely because Netflix has a documentary style narrative that humanized the drivers and maybe sort of is that part of NASCAR's future? Where do you think the sport kind of stands, given what you all have sort of looked back into, and now sort of as you cover your stuff on a day-to-day and ongoing basis, what do you think NASCAR is headed, both good or bad, in your minds? And one at a time, please.
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in and say that I think that NASCAR has really improved its on-track product, in particular in the last couple of years. I know if you're a member of any of there's tons and tons of groups out there on Facebook and social media that long for the good old days of NASCAR. But I think that the racing has really been good the last couple of years. And I think that I hope that only continues. And I think that's gonna if you give it a chance, if you're not some of these people that are so stuck in the past and won't realize that everything has to evolve, I think that's good for the sport, and I hope that it will continue that trend.
Yeah, Tim, I think things are on the way up, particularly versus maybe between 5 and 10 years ago when the product on track was in many cases not that attractive. Particularly the competition at the front was just not there. The cars were designed such that that passing was very difficult at many tracks, particularly the 1.5 mile tracks, and there's so many of those. Things are better now. They're not perfect. There's not going to be a great race every week, just like there's not a great baseball game every night, But NASCAR has realized that they had work to do, and they put a lot of smart people into that work. And I think the new car is significantly better. The racing generally is better. It's not great everywhere. It's never going to be great every weekend at every track. It's just the way it is. You have so many teams who are working in the same direction toward the same goal. And a lot of times they're going to land on the same idea, and the cars are going to be very close in speed. So you may not have a lot of passing at every track. It's the way the sport works. But generally speaking, I think they're on an upswing. There's generally more interest. There are new people coming into the sport, new teams. You look at what Trackhouse Racing has done. Having been on the ground not that long at all, they've created all kinds of interest with the way they're approaching the sport. So I think there's an upswing, still a ways to go to make it what it should be, but definitely improving, I think.
I think Kyle Busch is the only driver out there right now who absolutely polarizes half the grandstand. Half the crowd loves him, half the crowd hates him. NASCAR needs more people for fans to either adore or hate. There aren't any great rivalries anymore. Don't seem to be. No more Petty Pearson, no more Earnhardt Gordon. They need more Tony Stewart kind of people. Ross Chastain is the closest thing they're going to get for a while. Ty Gibbs and Noah Gragson came up together from Xfinity. They don't like each other. That over time, that might become something that fans will take to. But right now, if I'm wrong, you other three people tell me, I don't see that many characters out there that are moving people's emotions. What Chastain did last year at Martinsville is one of the greatest things I've ever seen in my 54 years of being out here.
I totally agree. I just, and to ban it, I think it's just.
Yeah, and they've taken to him. But there are very few people out there, very few drivers out there anymore who create that emotion. So I don't know. Kelly, what do you think? You've been watching them.
I think you have a point, Al. there are personalities in this sport, but it's just so rare that anybody's getting to see them, right? Because you have these drivers who are coming up younger and younger, and it's beaten into them from the beginning of how careful they have to be, and they go through media training. But yeah, Kyle Busch is one of the last ones, a Kevin Harvick of what you see is what you get. Yeah, and they're not afraid to say what they mean, and say what they believe. So I think you have a point on that with the personalities. In the grand scheme of things, Tim, going back to your question of where NASCAR is, I think when you look at the sport on any given weekend, you look at the numbers. The NFL, as everybody knows, is always going to be the benchmark. I think right now, for what NASCAR has going on, to consistently be pulling in 2 million, 3 million viewers is nothing to sneeze at. And when you look at the weekend, they're consistently either first or second up there of the most watched sporting events. Obviously, you always want more. I think attendance in-person attendance could be a little bit better. I do think it's unrealistic. Everybody's saying, oh, it's not sold out. It's not as it was in the 2000s. I think people need to reevaluate what's realistic in today's world of ratings and attendance. But I think NASCAR has to be as happy as they can be. Steve Phelps will constantly say that this is one of the most stable sports over the last 5 years or so. So I know they're constantly tooting that horn. You look at the car, and I think those numbers will only get better if the product gets better. I think what you see on the racetrack is going to translate to whether or not people are going to watch. I think this car has done a lot of really good things, particularly on the mile and a half. So I think it's absolutely amazing that the sport has gone from the mile and a half being the races that bored people to now they're some of the best racing out there. But now we have to fix short tracks and road courses. So I think if the product continues to get better, then I think ratings and attendance will get better. As Mike said, it's certainly starting to come back up on an upward swing since the pandemic. So overall, I think this is for 75 years to tie it in as they celebrate this milestone. I think the sport has to be pretty happy with where it's at right now.
Yeah, I all of those, I take those all to heart. I think all those are fair and insightful. I personally, I think you bring back some fins for some races, that might make for a throwback race. But no, I also, and again, I'm not sort of as long dyed in the wool fan, but the one thing there are two things. One, I worry about certain tracks maybe going away, or the Fontana situation, right? Seems like, just most of that broadcast just seemed like it was, looking back on the former Fontana track, right? It's not dead yet, but they're going to bring it back in a different form and that kind of stuff. But it almost felt like it was an obituary in many respects. And for every one of those, right, you can possibly lose a connection to the past. And I also wonder too, if there's any mechanism, and I'm sure the economics don't sort of support it these days, especially with the sponsors not being sort of the gigantic national brands of the 90s and early 2000s, although it can come back, I'm sure, is more, let's call them independent teams like the Wood Brothers and the one-offs and actually having a competitive, qualification, right? There's really no drama, if any, anymore, right? Because there's always there's never, very few people get bumped anymore because there's not a lot of challengers, so to speak. So I don't know. It feels to me like that's one way you could generate some real, I don't call it tension, but real drama, I guess, in the excitement of trying to qualify. Hey, remember the Indianapolis 500? Half of the excitement of I know that's Indy racing, but half of the excitement of that race every year was, is Janet Guthrie going to get in this year, right? Or is AJ going to make it on his last run because he failed on his first three? There's some drama to that sort of independent, if you will, or that challenge of actually making the race. But that's just, the old guy yelling at the clouds here. But, maybe you disagree, but those are my thoughts for what they're worth.
Well, Tim, you mentioned tracks going away. Prime example of that is Chicagoland Speedway, which is sitting out there in the far, far suburbs of Chicago, basically fading away, and now we're racing in downtown Chicago. It was said not that many years ago that a speedway that hosted NASCAR races, and almost all of them had 2 races a year. It was said that track could not survive if one of those races was taken away. Now we've seen that happen, and most of those tracks have survived. So it's a mixed bag of expectations and putting together numbers that people smarter than me deal with every day. It's my understanding that the deal that NASCAR put together with Chicago it leans really heavily in favor of NASCAR as far as the money that's being put out. I think they've gotten in a situation where they're going to get a ton of publicity, and some of it may be bad, but a ton of publicity out of this, regardless of the quality of the race. The quality of the competition in the Chicago street race is almost beside the point, because it's going to be such an event, either good, medium, or bad. It's going to get a lot of coverage, a ton more than racing at Chicagoland Speedway would in the same situation. So there are a lot of things to think about with tracks and sponsors. The big sponsor, Winston, went away years ago, and those times are never returning. They lifted the sport to an entirely new level with great professionalism, smarts, and not to mention millions of dollars and a lot of red and white paint, which made big differences. But we're not going to see that again. It's a whole new era. And I think the fact that people are looking in different directions to make things fit is the proper approach.
Well, Kentucky Speedway shut down. They've taken down a ton of seats at Richmond. They've taken down seats at New Hampshire. They've taken down seats at Charlotte, Daytona. At some point in time, somebody in Daytona Beach ran the numbers and said, we don't need these seats. We're not filling them. Let's sell the seats to some short track somewhere, which they've done. But I think, Mike, I think you're right. They've got people smart enough to recognize whatever problems they've got, and they're going to address them immediately. They're not going to dilly-dally and try to run 2 or 3 years in Kentucky more than they did the last couple of years, and they didn't draw any crowd. So I think there's hope ahead because they've got good people in charge now. Jim France, Elton Sawyer, Steve Phelps, people like that. I think they're going to be okay. They may not be as good as they were in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the early 2000s, but they'll be all right.
All right, and last question. What about television? Any predictions about where those rights are going to go? Fox, NBC. It's a different. I mean, the media realm right now is they're in cost-cutting modes right now. So it's. But I think the coverage has been excellent, especially technically over the last number of years. I just wonder where you think that coverage might go going forward, and will we see maybe streaming? Do you think more like MLS is doing with the Apple TV Plus and that kind of stuff?
I don't know where it's going, but I will say my prediction is that NASCAR is going to get a lot of money. I think they're going to get a lot of money, and I think they're going to continue to look at, what that streaming piece is going to be. So there's a lot of names out there of who could be in play. I don't know one way or another of who's it's going to be, but I think it's going to be for a lot of money. And I think at some point, yes, NASCAR has to seriously look at what the streaming component is going to be, because that is not just the future, that's right now. And I think sooner rather than later, they have to get on board with that.
Yes, since I work for NBC, I'll sort of stay out of this discussion, but I think Kelly's right. The future in that part of the media may look very different than it has for the last quarter century. And I think she's also right in there's going to be some stacks of money change hands over the next year or so.
My goodness, that was fun. I appreciated that conversation. And as you could probably tell, I'm more than a closet NASCAR fan. Very excited for the Chicago race coming up later this year in July. Hopefully we'll get to meet in person our guests this week, Jimmy Creed, Kelly Crandall, Mike Hembree, and Al Pearce. They, the authors of the book that you must run and not walk to get. It's called NASCAR 75 Years. It is published by Motor Books, and it is a tremendous accomplishment of photography and words. And if you're a longtime fan of NASCAR or a novice or just even curious about it for the first time, this book is something to behold and will school you in all of the great stuff that's occurred over 75 years of NASCAR's history. Of course, the most convenient way to purchase is to go early and often to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 300. Woohoo. And you'll find a convenient link to this book, as well as we do for all of our episodes. If there's ever a book or a movie or some other kind of thing to purchase or benefit from, the convenient links will always be there. And on occasion, we'll get a couple of shekels of referral love when you do so. We greatly appreciate that. Helps keep our lights on more than you will know. And while you're there, you'll see all the other 299 episodes. We post them all there. There's a nice little search box there. You can kind of search by team or league or name or whatever. And they're all there for you. Of course, the best way to ingest all of the goodness we push your way each week in audio form is to subscribe or follow us wherever you get podcasts. There is no excuse for you not to find us because we're available just about wherever you can get them. So do it now. And maybe give us a rating or review too, if there's a possibility there. We certainly love those 5 stars for sure. And what else? How about sending us some email? You can do that too, especially if you like the stuff you hear, or you've got some ideas or suggestions. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Social media, follow us on Twitter at goodseatsstill. On Instagram, Good Seats Still Available is our handle there. And on Facebook, you will also find us at Good Seats Still Available. Our thanks, as always, for every stinking 300 episodes, and hopefully for the near and maybe long-term future. Our pal, Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence through thick and thin. He has been by our side, and we couldn't appreciate it more. And thank you, great listeners. Thanks for helping us get this far. So much more in the hopper and on the horizon. And we hope you've enjoyed what we put together for you and stumbled and rumbled and fumbled our way through for these first 300 episodes, almost 7 years now, and lots more to come, God willing. So thank you so much for your support, your listenership, and until next week, let's keep it safe, everybody, and we'll see you. We love you tremendously, and thank you for listening. Bye.